You spend 6 weekends on a table. You sand it until your arms give out. You wipe on the finish, stand back, and it looks perfect. Exactly like the picture you had in your head when you started. 3 months later, there's a crack running straight through the top, right along the glue line, like the wood is trying to tear itself in half from the inside. Nothing you did that day caused it. The damage happened weeks earlier, before you'd even cut your first board, and you had absolutely no idea you were doing it, because everything felt right in the moment. By the end of this, you'll know the 5 mistakes quietly ruining wood projects for almost every beginner. The kind that don't show up the day you make them. They show up later, after the glue has cured and the finish has dried, when it's too late to fix without starting over from a fresh board. None of these require special tools or an upgraded shop. They require understanding what wood actually is before you start cutting it, because right now you're probably treating it like a fixed, finished material, and it never was one. Here's the part almost nobody explains before handing you a board. Wood isn't finished moving the day it leaves the mill. It keeps absorbing and releasing moisture from the air for its entire life, expanding across its width when humidity rises, shrinking when it drops, and almost none of that movement happens along its length. A board can be 4 inches wide in July and 3 15/16 in January, every single year, for as long as that board exists. Kiln-dried lumber usually leaves the mill somewhere around 6 to 8% moisture content, but a lumberyard warehouse, a garage with no climate control, or a shed sitting through a humid summer can push that same board toward 11, 12, even 14% before it ever reaches your workbench. That gap between what the wood was dried to and what it's sitting at when you buy it is exactly where warping starts, long before you've made a single cut. Miss that fact and everything else you learn about woodworking is built on sand. Mistake 1 is skipping acclimation. You buy lumber from a big box store or a lumber yard, bring it straight into your garage, and start cutting the same afternoon. That wood was likely stored in a warehouse with completely different humidity than your shop, sometimes drier, more often wetter, depending on the season and how the place was ventilated. The moment it enters your space, it starts adjusting, swelling or shrinking to match the new air around it, and that adjustment doesn't happen evenly. The outer surface reacts to the new humidity faster than the core of the board does, which means a board that looks perfectly stable on day 1 can still be shifting internally on day 5, even while it feels dry and steady to the touch. Sight down the length of a board before you buy it too, checking for a cup across its width or a bow along its length, because a board that's already moving in the store is only going to keep moving once it's under a different roof. Cut and join it before that adjustment finishes, and you're locking a board into a shape it doesn't want to hold. Stack your lumber in the space you'll actually build in, with thin strips of scrap between each layer so air reaches every board on every side. And give it at least a week, longer for thicker stock or for anything moving between a big swing in humidity, like lumber bought in a humid spring and brought into a shop that runs a dehumidifier all summer. It feels like wasted time. It's the opposite. It's the one step that prevents almost everything else on this list from getting worse. You'd think giving the wood time to settle solves the movement problem completely. It doesn't. Acclimation handles the humidity mismatch between the store and your shop. It does nothing about the humidity swings your finished project will face for the rest of its life, sitting in a house that gets dry in winter and humid in summer, year after year. Mistake 2 is cutting and planing without reading the grain direction first. Every board has a direction the fibers lean, rising and falling slightly along the length, even in wood that looks perfectly straight grain from across the shop. And running a blade or a plane against that lean instead of with it tears the fibers out instead of slicing them cleanly. You get a rough, torn surface that looks fine right after the cut and then refuses to sand smooth no matter how long you work at it, because you're not smoothing a clean surface anymore. You're trying to fill in a field of tiny craters where fibers were ripped loose instead of sliced through. Look at the edge of the board before you touch a tool to it. The grain lines should look like they're diving into the surface as you move your hand in the cutting direction, not lifting up and away from it, almost like running your hand down a cat's fur instead of against it. Feed the tool the direction the grain dives, and the fibers shear cleanly instead of splintering upward. Get it backward, and even a freshly sharpened blade will leave a surface that looks fuzzy and torn under any raking light, the kind of light that comes through a garage door left half open in the late afternoon, which is exactly the light that will eventually catch it once the piece is sitting in someone's living room. Mistake 3 is where beginners genuinely can't be blamed for not knowing, because it isn't intuitive at all. You build a wide panel, a tabletop or a cabinet side, and you glue it up edge to edge exactly like you'd assemble anything else, treating the whole panel as one rigid piece the same way you'd treat a sheet of plastic or a slab of stone. Then you attach it solidly on all 4 sides, maybe screwed straight into a frame or glued into a rabbet all the way around, because that seemed like the sturdy way to do it, the way that wouldn't ever come loose. That panel is going to expand across its width every single humid season and contract again every dry one, sometimes by 1/16 of an inch per foot of width or more depending on the species. And if you've locked every edge down tight with no room for that movement, the wood has exactly one place left to release that pressure. Through itself, along whichever line happens to be weakest, usually a glue seam or a knot. That's the crack running down the middle of the table. Not bad glue, not a defective board. Wood doing exactly what wood always does, with nowhere left to do it. And this is where it stops being one isolated problem and starts compounding. A panel that wasn't acclimated properly, built from boards cut against the grain, so the surface was never truly flat to begin with, then locked down rigid on every edge. That's not one mistake anymore. That's wood already under internal stress, trapped with no room to expand, with a rough surface hiding the strain until the exact month it finally lets go. And it's rarely the month you'd expect. It's usually the first real swing of the seasons after the piece leaves your shop. The first winter, the heat kicks on, and the air inside a house drops to a fraction of the humidity it held all summer, pulling moisture out of that panel faster than it ever came out during acclimation. Because acclimation only matched your shop. It never had to match the living room the table would eventually sit in. Mistake 4 is sanding straight to a fine grit and skipping the steps in between. You start at 220 because it feels faster, because the coarser grits look like they're just making more scratches, more work to undo later. Every grit you skip leaves scratches from the previous. Coarser grit still buried in the wood, and a fine grit can't remove damage. It was never designed to cut through, it can only polish around it. It just polishes the surface around those deeper scratches. So the wood looks smooth in normal light and then shows every skip step the moment finish hits it, because finish doesn't hide scratches. It highlights them by adding sheen and depth exactly where the light can now catch every flaw you thought you'd sanded away. Walk the grits in order, one step at a time, roughly doubling each time, 80, then 120, then 150, then 220. Each grit's entire job is removing the scratch pattern left by the one before it. Nothing more. And skipping a step means that pattern never actually leaves the wood. It just gets buried under a thinner layer of finer scratches sitting on top of it. Run your hand across the surface at an angle to the grain between each grit, not straight along it, because your fingers will catch a ridge your eyes will miss every time, especially under shop lighting that flattens out shadows and hides exactly the kind of unevenness you're trying to find before the finish finds it for you. Mistake 5 is staining without conditioning on wood that's prone to blotching. And this is the mistake that makes an otherwise perfect project. Look amateur in seconds, right at the very last step, after every other part of the build went exactly right. Pine, birch, cherry, and maple all have grain structures with patches of open, porous fiber sitting right next to patches of tight, dense fiber, sometimes switching every half inch across the same board. Stain is absorbed by whichever fiber lets it in fastest, so those open patches soak up far more color than the surrounding wood, and you end up with dark, blotchy patches scattered across a surface that felt perfectly smooth and even to the touch just minutes earlier. A pre-stain conditioner partially fills those open, porous pockets before the stain ever goes on, evening out how much color each area of the board can absorb, so the whole surface takes the stain at roughly the same rate. Skip it on blotch-prone species, and no amount of careful brushwork or steady hands saves you, because the unevenness was never about your technique or how you applied the stain. It was already built into the wood before you ever opened the can. Test on an offcut from the same board first, not a random scrap from the bin, because blotching varies board to board even within the same species. And the offcut is the only sample that actually tells you the truth about the piece you're finishing. Here's the part that reframes all 5 of these at once. None of them are really separate problems. They're the same problem showing up at 5 different stages. Wood is a material that's still alive in every sense that matters. Still moving, still absorbing, still reacting to the air around it, right up until the day it eventually stops existing as wood at all, decades or centuries from now. Beginners treat lumber like it's a finished, stable material the moment it's milled into a flat board. Something closer to plastic or metal. Something that holds still once you've cut it to size. It never stops behaving like the tree it came from, and it never will, no matter how many coats of finish go on top of it. Acclimation, grain direction, panel construction, sanding, staining. Every single one of these mistakes comes from forgetting that fact at a different point in the process, from treating a living, breathing material as if it were an inert one. That's also why these mistakes are so easy to miss the first time. The board looks flat when you buy it, the cut looks clean the day you make it, the tabletop looks flawless the moment you finish sanding it. Every one of these failures is invisible on day 1 and obvious 3 months later, which is exactly why beginners keep making them, project after project, without ever connecting the crack in this table to the same mistake in the last one or the one before that. You don't get the feedback in time to learn from it the normal way, through immediate consequence. So the lesson has to come from somewhere else, from someone telling you before the wood does. Fix these 5 and something changes that goes beyond just avoiding damage. Your joints stop needing repair a year later. Your panels stay flat instead of cupping or bowing across a season. Your finish goes on even, in one coat, instead of needing 3 attempts and a lot of sanding back through mistakes you didn't know you'd made until the stain revealed every one of them at once. Wood stops being unpredictable and starts being a material you can actually plan around, because you're no longer fighting a material that's working against decisions you made without knowing it, decisions that felt reasonable at the time and only turned out to be mistakes months after the fact. That's the real pattern behind almost every ruined project a beginner blames on bad luck, or a bad board, or simply not being skilled enough yet, when really the board was fine and the skill was never really the issue at all. It was never about skill with a saw or a brush. It was about respecting what wood actually is before you ever pick up a tool, because the tree doesn't know it's furniture now, and it never stops acting like it's still standing outside, breathing with the seasons the same way it always has. If this just saved a project you haven't started yet, stick around, because there's a lot more sitting in a beginner's blind spot that nobody explains before it costs them a table, a cabinet, or an entire weekend they can't get back. Subscribe, and the next crack you avoid is one you'll never even have to notice, because it never gets the chance to happen in the first place.